Welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling a really baffling and tragic case today. The quadruple homicide of the Dardeen family happened back in Corelli, Illinois, November 1987. Just 4 lives lost with such brutality. It's still shocking.
It really is. In this case, even after all these decades, it just raises so many questions when violence like this goes unanswered. The details are particularly disturbing.
They are.
And the fact that there's no definite resolution, well, that's something we really need to dig into.
Okay, so let's set the scene. We have Keith Dardeen. He was 29, his wife Elaine, 30, and she was pregnant, heavily pregnant.
Right.
Their little boy, Peter, just 2 years old, and tragically, Elaine's unborn daughter, all murdered.
Horrific.
Elaine and Peter were beaten inside their mobile home. I mean, a really savage attack. Elaine actually went into labor during it.
Unbelievable.
And the newborn baby also died from the same assault. Then Keith, he's found the next day.
Yeah.
In a field nearby. Shot and mutilated. It's almost too much to process.
Well, the fact that the bodies were separated and Keith died differently from his family, that immediately suggests, a complex chain of events.
Yeah.
The sheer brutality against Elaine and Peter, especially using Peter's own baseball bat, that points towards intense, maybe personal rage.
Right.
But then the mutilation of Keith adds this whole other layer, maybe a different motive aimed just at him.
And what's so confusing is there was no sign of forced entry at the trailer. And the investigators, they quickly ruled out robbery and sexual assault. Nothing valuable was even taken.
Right.
This lack of an obvious motive, it just makes the whole thing deeper, doesn't it?
Absolutely. When you don't have forced entry, it often suggests, well, either the victims knew the attacker or the attacker got in without raising alarm.
Okay.
And the fact that valuables were left behind, that pushes you away from a simple crime for gain. You start thinking about more personal, maybe even irrational reasons.
And this all happened in a town that was already kind of on edge.
Yeah, that's important context.
There'd been a whole string of murders nearby in the couple of years leading up to this. People were genuinely scared, buying guns, arming themselves.
Understandable.
And you know how it is. Rumors started flying, these wild theories about, like, satanic ritual killings, which the police did shut down pretty quickly.
Right, but it shows the level of fear.
Yeah, it just paints this picture of a town really gripped by fear and uncertainty.
And that existing fear probably just amplified the reaction to the Dardeen murders.
Of course.
Communities really struggle to process violence this extreme, and when there's no clear information, fear and speculation just take over.
Then there's this other really strange detail. Keith's car, it was a red Plymouth, it just turns up, parked near the police station in Benton, which is miles away.
Right.
And there's blood spatter inside. So this discovery, remember he was initially a suspect. It just throws another wrench into everything. What do you even make of that?
That car's location is a huge unanswered question. Crucial. Was it Keith who drove it there? Why? Or was it the killer? And if it was the killer, why leave it near the police station? It feels calculated, but what it means, still unclear.
So despite all the investigation, all these bizarre details, and there was even a confession years later we need to talk about, the Dardeen family homicides are still officially unsolved. It's a case that sticks with you because of the horror, obviously, but also all these lingering questions.
That lack of closure in a case this brutal, it leaves a lasting wound. Not just for the family, obviously, but for the whole community's memory. It just highlights that frustration, that pain of not knowing.
Let's talk a bit more about who the Dardeens actually were.
Okay.
They went by their middle names, Keith and Elaine.
Yeah.
Keith, he worked at the water treatment plant out at Red Lake. That's actually what brought them to the area.
Right, they moved for the job.
Yeah, they bought the mobile home in Aina back in '86 because of that job.
Yeah.
Just seemed like a normal step for a young family starting out.
And that move, it represents trying to build something, stability, opportunity. His job provided that. And them settling in Ina, it just paints a picture of a couple building their life.
Lane worked, too, at an office supply store over in Mount Vernon, and they were involved in their church, a small Baptist church. Keith sang, Elaine played piano.
Sounds like they were connected.
Yeah, definitely part of their local community. Just sounds like a pretty typical small-town family, really.
Their church involvement, it speaks to that sense of community, belonging. These little details, they make them real people, and it makes the violence they suffered just even harder to grasp.
And they were expecting their second child, a daughter. They'd even picked out names, Ian or Casey.
Oh.
That anticipation, a new baby, a sibling for little Peter.
Yeah.
It just makes the tragedy feel even sharper.
Yeah, that anticipation of growing their family really highlights the future that was stolen. It just adds another layer of heartbreaking loss.
And here's something else. They were actually planning to move again.
No.
Yeah, they'd put the mobile home up for sale. Keith had even told his mother he regretted moving to Ena. He felt the area was getting too violent. He actually mentioned the number of homicides in the county recently, like that awful Odell family murder case. It really suggests he was feeling uneasy about where they lived.
Keith expressing that regret, his awareness of the local violence, that's significant. It suggests he was concerned, maybe felt vulnerable there, which, knowing what happened, is just incredibly tragic.
He'd gotten really protective, especially after a local rape and murder just a few months before this.
Right.
His mom mentioned he even refused to let a woman use their phone one night. It really shows how on edge he must have been, how much fear was in the air.
That protectiveness, yeah, it illustrates the climate they were living in.
Yeah.
And it's just tragically ironic that despite those precautions, they still became victims of something so horrific.
So, okay, let's walk through how this awful discovery happened. Keith missed work on November 18th. Very unusual for him.
Right, out of character.
Calls to the house went unanswered. So his supervisor called his parents. And that simple act of concern, that's what kicked off the chain of events that uncovered everything.
It really highlights how important routine is. Sometimes when that routine breaks, it signals something's deeply wrong. His reliability at work basically led to the discovery.
So Keith's father, Don Dardeen, he met the police at the trailer. He had a key. What they found inside, just horrific. Elaine, Peter, and the newborn baby, all dead in the bed. Elaine was bound and gagged. Both she and Peter had been beaten, apparently with Peter's own baseball bat.
God, that detail.
The violence was so extreme, Elaine went into labor. It's almost unbearable to even think about.
The scene just screams unimaginable brutality, a savage attack on a defenseless family, using a child's toy as the weapon. That adds a particularly twisted, disturbing element.
And Keith was missing. So was his car. So initially, like we said, suspicion fell on him.
Naturally at first.
But then the very next day, hunters found his body out in a wheat field near Red Lake College. He'd been shot. And then there was the added horror of the mutilation.
Yeah.
And then his car turns up at the Benton police station, blood inside. The way these discoveries unfolded,
Yeah.
it's just chilling.
Finding Keith's body, realizing he was also a victim, that completely reframes the whole thing. The gunshot, the mutilation, it suggests he was also targeted with extreme violence, maybe even a different kind of violence than his family faced.
Right.
And the car's location just hangs there as this major puzzle piece.
The impact on the community must have been massive. We touched on the fear already being there. This just cranked it up to 11. People started carrying guns more openly. Even little things changed, like kids not waiting outside after school events anymore. It really shattered the sense of safety in that small town.
That change in behavior, it just underscores the profound psychological impact of a crime like this, especially when it's unsolved. It eats away at the community's sense of security, of trust.
Early on, the information coming out was limited, sometimes confusing, even contradictory.
Which often happens.
Yeah, and that unfortunately just fueled speculation. There were different stories about how Keith died, and the whole situation with the baby led to some really disturbing rumors, including that satanic angle, even though police eventually debunked it. Sounds like just a period of intense fear and, frankly, misinformation.
Yeah, and in times of crisis, especially when official info is scarce or unclear, rumors just spread like wildfire.
Yeah.
And that can traumatize the community even more, and it can complicate the investigation too.
The coroner's reports, they figured out the time of death for everyone was pretty close, within about an hour for Elaine and the kids.
Okay.
They were found about 12 hours after they likely died. But Keith, he apparently died 24 to 36 hours before his body was found.
That's a significant difference.
Yeah, that discrepancy in the timeline, it raises some really critical questions about when and where Keith was actually killed, doesn't it?
Definitely. That timeline is vital for trying to piece together what happened. The difference suggests Keith might have been killed at a different time, maybe even a different place than his family. It makes the sequence of events way more complicated.
And there were also these really weird details back at the mobile home crime scene.
Yeah.
The bodies were like tucked into bed. There was some evidence someone tried to clean up a bit. The back door was open, but again, no forced entry and nothing valuable taken.
Okay, wait, tucked into bed?
Yeah. That combination, it seems to point to someone who wasn't rushed, maybe someone familiar with the family or the house. What do you make of that?
The tucking the bodies in, That's particularly unsettling. It could suggest, I don't know, a bizarre kind of intimacy, control, maybe even some twisted form of remorse. It's hard to say.
Yeah.
The cleanup attempt shows a deliberate effort to hide evidence. And the lack of forced entry, the untouched valuables, that keeps pointing away from typical motives. Points towards something deeply personal, maybe.
They also found a small amount of marijuana in the trailer. Investigators didn't think it belonged to the Dardeens, though.
Okay.
The idea was maybe the killer left it. Autopsies were clean, no drugs, no alcohol in any of the victims. So it just seems like another potential clue that just went nowhere.
Right. The marijuana, while interesting at first, didn't link to the victim, so it probably was brought in by someone else. Adds another confusing detail without giving a clear answer.
So when you try to figure out the why, the obvious motives, robbery, sexual assault, they were ruled out fast.
Yeah, eliminated early.
No sign of marriage trouble, affairs, nothing like that.
Yeah.
They briefly considered gambling debts because they found some sports scores, but everyone described Keith as super frugal, like reselling sodas to save money for Peter's college fund, kind of frugal.
Ruling out those common motives really highlights how unusual these murders were. And Keith's reputation for being careful with money makes a big gambling debt seem really unlikely.
Mistaken identity was floated as an idea. And Keith's mom, Joanne, she had her own heartbreaking theories. Like maybe Keith refused to get involved in drug dealing or something illegal, or maybe someone Elaine had rejected came back for revenge. When there are no answers, the family's left just grappling with possibilities like that.
Absolutely. In that vacuum of hard evidence, those alternative theories, they represent the family just desperately trying to find some explanation for something so senseless. They come from knowing the victims, knowing their lives.
Even the FBI profilers who looked at this case apparently found it incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Said it defied their usual analysis methods.
Wow.
That really tells you just how unusual and baffling this crime really was.
Yeah, the fact that experienced FBI profilers struggled to categorize it speaks volumes. It suggests maybe a perpetrator or a combination of factors. It just doesn't fit the typical patterns they see in violent crime.
Then years go by. We get to the early 2000s, and the case takes this really strange turn. A confession.
Right, Tommy Lynn Sells.
Yeah, the serial killer, Tommy Lynn Sells. He was already on death row down in Texas. And suddenly it looked like maybe, finally, there was going to be an answer.
It definitely offered a potential path to closure. But, as we'll get into, his claims were met with a lot of skepticism pretty quickly and, well, didn't really lead to a definitive resolution.
Sells gave different stories, didn't he?
He did. Varying accounts.
In one version, he said he met Keith at a truck stop or maybe a pool hall, got invited back to the house, and then got angry because Keith supposedly made a sexual proposition. Sometimes he even said it was for a threesome with Elaine.
Right. A really disturbing claim, and one that people who knew Keith just fiercely disputed.
Yeah, they did. Sells said he then forced Keith out to the field, killed him, mutilated him, then went back to the trailer and killed Elaine, Peter, and the baby to get rid of witnesses. Said it was all rage.
That narrative, the escalating rage after the alleged proposition, that was his attempt to explain the extreme violence against the whole family.
But then there was another version he told, where he claimed he saw the for sale sign on the trailer, pretended he was interested in buying it, overpowered Keith, made him tie up his family, then took Keith to the field, killed and mutilated him there, and then went back, raped Elaine, and killed everyone else. These stories being so different, that immediately raises red flags, right?
Huge red flags. The significant discrepancies between his own versions of what happened immediately cast doubt on how reliable he was. These inconsistencies just make it really hard to know if any part of his confession was true.
And despite these confessions, Sells was never actually charged in the Dardeen case. The authorities in Texas wouldn't let him be extradited to Illinois.
Right.
So this potential lead, it just never went to trial, never got tested in court.
Those jurisdictional limits basically prevented Illinois from pursuing charges against Sells directly. So his confession was left unprosecuted, unresolved legally.
And there were really serious doubts about whether he was even telling the truth. Sells was known for false confessions.
A common issue with some serial offenders.
Yeah. And details he gave often didn't quite match the evidence, like where Keith was supposedly shot in the car or the position Elaine's body was found in. Those contradictions are hard to just ignore.
Those inconsistencies between what Sells said and the physical evidence, those were major red flags for the investigators. Plus, his history of false confessions just eroded his credibility even further.
Sells tried to explain away the lack of physical evidence connecting him by saying, well, he was a transient, nobody knew him, he wasn't on the radar, which, okay, maybe, but it doesn't really address the contradictions in his actual story.
Right. While he tried to account for the lack of forensics, his explanation didn't really square with the discrepancies in his narrative compared to the known facts.
And the Texas police, who dealt with Sells, they thought he might just be confessing to avoid the death penalty in Texas.
A tactic some have used, yeah.
Which really makes you question his true motive for confessing at all.
The possibility that his confessions were strategic, aimed at avoiding execution, just adds another layer of complexity when you're trying to figure out if he was telling the truth.
And maybe most importantly, the friends and family of the Dardeens just did not buy his stories at all. They said it was highly unlikely Keith would just invite a total stranger home, especially with all the fear in the community back then. And they absolutely rejected the claim about a homosexual advance, said it was completely out of character for Keith.
Right.
Even the detectives seemed to think Sells might have just made that part up to try and make his action seem somehow justified.
The strong, consistent denials from people who knew Keith well regarding those key parts of Sells' confession, especially the invitation and the alleged advance, that really undermined his credibility in their eyes, and probably in the investigators' eyes, too.
Keith's mother, Joanne Dardeen, her reaction evolved over time, which is understandable.
Heartbreaking journey for her.
Initially, she thought Sells might be the killer. She said she wanted to know all the details. But as time went on, she started to have doubts. After he was executed, she said she felt his story just didn't really fit with what she knew about her son.
Wow.
She'd actually hoped he would stay alive, so maybe the real truth could eventually come out definitively. It was just so sad to hear her go through that.
Joanne Dardeen's changing perspective really reflects that emotional turmoil, the uncertainty the family lived with. Her initial hope for closure giving way to more doubt. It just highlights the ongoing pain of this unsolved case.
So beyond Sells, investigators did look elsewhere.
Right, they had to.
Early on, there was a coworker of Keith's he'd had some dispute with, but that person was cleared. They also briefly looked at Angel Micherino Resendiz, the railroad killer.
Ah, yes. His M.O. involved hopping trains, beating victims.
Exactly. But they couldn't find any connection to the Dardeen case. It seems like they explored different avenues, at least.
Yeah, the investigation did seem to cover various leads, local issues, other known offenders. It shows they made a comprehensive effort, but just couldn't land on the person responsible.
So ultimately, the Dardeen family homicides just remained this enduring, really tragic mystery. Left a huge scar on the community and obviously on the Dardeen family. Joanne Dardeen spent years trying to keep the case alive. She even went on national TV shows like America's Most Wanted.
Trying to generate new leads.
Yeah, but sadly, nothing concrete ever came from it. Her dedication, though, it speaks volumes about a mother's love and her fight for answers, for justice.
Her tireless efforts really underscore the profound, lasting impact of this crime. Her determination to keep it in the public eye highlights why we shouldn't forget these victims.
The fear, the disruption that followed these murders. It just shows the far-reaching consequences of brutal, unsolved violence like this. And the surviving family, they're still searching for answers. That quest just continues.
The legacy of the Dardeen murders is just a stark reminder of the enduring pain and uncertainty that unsolved crimes inflict on people, families, whole communities.
So yeah, we're left with this central haunting question. How could a seemingly normal, happy family be targeted in such a brutal, seemingly senseless way? With no clear motive, no definitive answer, even after all this time, it's just a profound tragedy.
That lack of a clear motive is still one of the most perplexing, most disturbing parts of this case. It really underscores the unpredictable nature of violence sometimes, and how hard it can be to understand the why behind such brutality.
And the details. They're just so horrific to even revisit. A pregnant mother going into labor during the attack, a 2-year-old child murdered, the father found mutilated. It's just a cascade of violence that's almost impossible to fully grasp.
The layering of tragedy upon tragedy here. The loss of the unborn child, the murder of little Peter, the brutal deaths of Keith and Elaine. It makes it a particularly devastating, unforgettable crime.
And that confession from Tommy Lynn Sells, which for a moment seemed like it might finally provide answers.
Yeah.
ultimately just added more confusion, more doubt. It's a really stark reminder of how complex, how frustrating these cold cases can become.
Cell's confession introduced that possibility of resolution, but in the end, it just highlighted the challenges, relying on unreliable narrators, the absolute need for corroborating evidence.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Dardeen family homicides, maybe let's leave you, the listener, with this. Thinking about all the conflicting information, the sheer brutality, this enduring mystery. What stands out most to you from this case? What unanswered question is still nagging at you?
This case really forces us to confront some of the darkest aspects of, well, human behavior and the lasting pain caused by violence that goes unanswered. It reminds us how important that search for truth is and the profound impact these tragedies have.
We encourage you to think about the complexities here and the very real human cost when crimes like this remain unsolved. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.